Hello and welcome, and in this week's episode we go to GP. We look at the GS70. Now, there have been various donor cars that have had a big influence on the kit car industry, and few have had more influence than the Volkswagen Beetle. One of the great exponents of the Beetle-based kits was GP Mouldings, and here Steve Hull tells their story.
My name's Steve Hull, editor of TKC Mag and TotalKitcar.com, and I'd like to warmly welcome you to our humble little channel. If you've been here before, you'll know what we're all about here. We highlight and inform and reawaken interest in kit car marks and cars of the past, as well as covering the great people and the incredibly talented designers that have graced our industry in the last 75 years now. 1949, when Derek Buckler became shall we say, the father of the industry, when he started selling replicas of his little chassis kit from his auto test and trials and sprint car. Today, if you're new around here, sorry, beg your pardon, if as I say, warm welcome. If you're new around here, we do cover the industry's great past. And even if you're not new and you're an old hand, I warmly welcome you back once again, and you know about what we do here. So I hope you're going to enjoy this episode, which we're going to get stuck into right away. A company called GP Projects, or alternatively at various times over their existence, were known as GP Speed Shop, GP Specialist Vehicles, even I think from the early days, JC Jobber Limited. That was co-founder John Jobber. I think when they belong right at the top table, when the dancing stops and we put our toys away, they'll be regarded as one of the elite manufacturers of our industry. Though they had a 33-year history, which is pretty good going. And it wasn't all milk and honey. They had some tough times during that period. And it has to be said, lots of models came and lots were successful, as we'll find out. But there were some duds in sales terms. But as I said, by crikey, the successes were big, very big. And yeah, we'll look at all that. Let's best not get ahead of ourselves here. So let's look at how the company came to be. John had been an apprentice at Jaguar, but as a motorsport fan, he then moved to Brabham, graduating to their Formula One team in 1966, which is when he met South African Pierre du Plessis, who was working at Lola, the rival company Lola. The pair had a mutual friend called Peter Allnutt, Allnutt, another very nice chap. Decided that it'd be good to work together, so set up a company called GP Speed Shop, and the GP meant nothing more than Grand Prix, in honour of what they'd been doing, I think. That initial workshop was adjacent to the Grand Union Canal, River Brent, right by Brentford gauging lock in a place called the Ham in Brentford, to be completely precise. The company's initial work in those early 60s, and those mid-60s days, they were doing race car prep, which is what they knew, particularly GT40s and Lola T70s. And at various times, cars that passed through their hands included those for people like Denny Hume, Frank Gardner, and Paul Hawkins. And the cars they got wasn't really surprising given their background and pedigree. In 1967, du Plessis went back to his native South Africa for a break, elongated holiday, and which was actually a busman's holiday because he was spannering for well-known racing driver David Piper at the Kyalami 9-hour race. It was there that he spotted a very significant vehicle in the future history of GP. It was a beach buggy called the Lillette, which bore a bit of a resemblance to the Mayor's Manx. And you know where I'm going with this. Within a few months, this chance encounter resulted in a set of Lillette moulds arriving in Brentford at the GP workshop. And it wasn't very long before the GP buggy was born. and the company had a huge success on its hands. They weren't actually the first beach buggy to the market in the UK. The word boom, beach buggy boom, has been used and bandied about quite a lot, and it really was. I've spoken to a couple of people, well, one of which, James Hale, who's regarded as the beach buggy guru, all knowledge about these beach buggy things go to James. Really, he knows everything. He's a very knowledgeable chap. And also, of course, I spoke. John Jobber told me, and a few others around at the time, that period probably between sort of 1968 and the end of 71 was the period to be making beach buggies. And they were regularly turning out 150 a month, 150 kits a month, and they were struggling to keep up. I think John told me once that they really weren't prepared for the phenomenon that became the GP beach buggy. And of course they were, whatever came after it, they had the foresight and the knowledge. Really, they could see what was going to happen. They could see it wasn't going to last. So some of the cars that came immediately after the buggy, although it never actually went away, its sales successes had diminished, were to make up the shortfall in sales when the inevitable happened. Because for a little company to lose 150 sales a month of one particular product, and let's say they had something that sold 5 a month, that's a massive shortfall in turnover and profitability. So they knew that they had to do something. In September 68, they moved to the old Aston Martin factory at Hanworth Air Park. And at that time, they also appointed a network of agency around the UK, agencies around the UK. I'll get my teeth in a minute. And this is possibly not the rightest thing they ever did. They gave a set of moulds to some of the best-selling agents, and the intention was very honourable. They wanted to alleviate all the backlogs, which were soon going to pile up, and the idea being that give them a set of moulds and they could satisfy customer demand in their own areas. All it actually did in reality was generate new manufacturers who suddenly had a beach buggy that looked just like a GP. They did actually convert a block of chicken sheds in Wallingford in Oxfordshire to moulding sheds to help them keep up with the demand. And they also were making Guildford fire engine and bus cart manufacturer Dennis. They were making their bodies too. The cabs, so that was really keeping them very busy. The long wheelbase GP super buggy, the unmodified Beetle floorpan version, arrived in autumn of 1969. Didn't sell as well as the short wheelbase one, but it did do very well still. And it was by 1972 that the interest in buggies had waned slightly, but probably because what was cool cruising down Ventura Highway in Southern California, or even on Madeira Drive in Brighton on a warm sunny afternoon, wasn't quite so attractive in the pouring rain in Dalston High Street on a Wednesday. However, John was a shrewd guy, and he'd seen it coming, and he already had a two-seater GT type car coupe called the Centron, and a thing called the LDV, which is a pickup come van buggy type creation waiting in the wings. He also saw the potential of export markets, and a stand at the Geneva Motor Show of 1972 helped develop those markets. And that time they also introduced I've never really got to the bottom of it, a thing called the water buggy, which was used on water at that time too. And that kind of disappeared from dispatches fairly soon afterwards. I will resist the temptation to say it sunk without trace, but anyway. That's the sort of time was when John developed a collaboration with Swiss sports car manufacturer or kit car manufacturer Albar Mettler, or Alois Bar Mettler, of a company called Albar, Albar, and they represented each other and swapped a couple of products for their home markets, and that worked quite well until it didn't. They also had a fire at Hanworth, which was said to decimate the factory. But daunted but unbowed, they worked from a caravan before finding temporary accommodation at Sion Hill Garage in Isleworth. So nothing really could stop them at that end. By the end of 1972, they'd moved to the premises that they spent the largest period of time in, Wharton, Worton Hall Industrial Estate, which notably was the location. Well, it's got quite a good. There's a couple of good stories about that. It was the original location. Well, it was the location of the old Isleworth film studios, where movies such as African Queen had been filmed. And GP occupied the old canteen area, all 4,500 square foot of it. Ironically, again, with another film connection, or certainly media connection, that site is now part of the Sky TV studios headquarters, call it what you will, which is quite interesting. At the tail end of 1973, Jobber and Duplessis renamed the company GP Concessionaires. And the range at that time was made up of the buggy, the super buggy, the LDV, a car called the Ranchero, and other bits and pieces coming along. Jobber took 6 months off at that time, and he used the time to gain his pilot's license. And when he returned, Duplessis departed and went back to live in his native South Africa, although tragically developed peritonitis, and I think he died soon after that, really, which is a real shame. He was a nice chap, by all accounts. I remember John used to speak very fondly of him. The business was affected, like many others, by the recession in the early 70s, in 1973, really, with 3-day week and God knows what else, power cuts and goodness knows what was going on in England. Early 74, a merchant bank purchased the company, although they retained Jobber as managing director. Sales had slowed again, but the introduction of a range of styling parts of a VW Beetle nature helped cover that shortfall, and they became big players in that market. Not as big as nearby Brentford. Where were they? Very nearby, and I can't think of the place where they were based, Cartoon, but they were still notable in sales terms, put it that way. They then, that summer, again, another interesting story, GP's glass fibre laminating division moved to what was then the vacated Marcos factory in Westbury, because that was the period when Marcos or Gem, they'd gone into liquidation or about to, and Gem ceased trading. So that site was empty, so Jobber filled it. March 75, even though sales had begun to increase and business was getting back on its feet, the bankers suddenly took flight and they wanted out. In which case Jobber took over ownership of the company again, but he changed the name to GP Concessionaires Limited, with again the same product range, really. It was the same product range. Then came again. They were never afraid to bring unusual cars or vehicles, I should say, or devices into their range. And the late 70s, early 80s saw the arrival of a thing called the Rabbit, which was a small boat project intended for the export market, though they sold a few in the UK. And it was the first model bearing the mark of another Kitcar industry legend, design in terms of design, Neville Trickett, who would become associated with GP in following years. And he started really proper design work for GP in 1978. And he by that time he'd brought his hovercraft kit with him. I think and that became a GP project. I think they sold about 60 of them. Initially it was powered by a 640cc two-stroke, which certainly gave it some poke, I would imagine. But GP changed that to Beetle power. Trickett's first real car for GP was the Talon, and that appeared in 1979. 80s dawned with Trickett's very successful for GP Madison, neo sort of classic type inspired car, and that was a big seller for GP. Then came the Turbo Beetle conversion, and also a go faster kit for the Golf Mark 1. And that mentioning Albar Mettler of Albar in Switzerland, that the Turbo Beetle was one of his products, and he'd sold about 200 of them in Switzerland, I think. Once again, I know probably it was by the late 70s. It was almost got back to where it was with the buggy boom, given all the extra work they were doing. The fiberglass division had moved again, I beg your pardon, this time up to Redditch in Worcestershire, under the control of Robin Humphreys, and they were making stuff like fairings for police motorcycles, and even the panels. And older readers might remember AA phone boxes by the side of the road in the UK. If you broke down your membership, you got a key and entitled you to go from one of these yellow phone boxes to call for assistance. And GP were making them. Jobber also owned, amongst these other things, he owned a company called Special Marine, who were based on the Isle of Wight, and he'd become a very skilled aerobatic pilot, a very skilled one. I think he flew it wasn't a Pitts, it was a thing called a Stolp, STOLP maybe, SA 900 V-Star, and he would regularly be off at demonstrations and air displays and such like. 2001, he developed a liking for Switzerland, and he had a place there. And in 2001, John decided he wanted to retire, and he wanted to spend more time in Switzerland and also flying his aircraft. And he sold the business to, which was by then down to a single model actually, with the RSK Porsche RSK replica, and he sold the operation to a guy called Bart Eertgerts, a Belgian Kitcar enthusiast, who changed the name of the company to GP Technical, and he moved himself down to Helston in Cornwall on the same industrial estate as one Richard Oakes, indeed. Bart didn't sell many Spiders, but he had a good go at it, and give credit where it was due, he did definitely further develop the VW Golf-based version of the GP Spider before he ceased training in 2004. I think he built at least one of those, and that must be quite a serious bit of kit, that. But let's go through some of the GP models while we're still here, and the clock catches up with me. GP Alpine and Super Buggy. Like this, the Super Buggy, as I mentioned, was a long wheelbase version of the standard buggy on an unmodified Beetle floor pan, and it featured a few styling revisions, notably at the rear, and of course could carry 4 people. Launched at the Specialist Sports Car Show in January 1970, January 1970. And it had an addition of a full-sized engine cover, and that gave it German TUV regulation compliance. Various Mark II version in 1975 had a tub that was more similar in style to the GP LDV. Mark III came along in 1977, August to be precise. That had a new bonnet and various other bits and pieces. And I think about 1,600, went for a few hands, that car, and I think about 1,600 of them were produced over the years. That is an insignificant number, really, unbelievably, compared to the sales success of the standard GP buggy, the one that was inspired by the Lolette that Duplessis had seen in South Africa, and over 4,000. I think 4,200 is a good number. And they'd sold 1,700 of the Mark I's before a Mark II version came along in 1977. So they were really doing quite well with that. Hardtop version of it really was we've heard of the Ranchero, and that effectively was a hardtop version of the buggy, really. Certainly the GP buggy is one of the most significant kit cars to be sold in the UK. That is without doubt, given those numbers. There's also a very good story about a Boxing Day race at Brands Hatch on Boxing Day, I think 1968 perhaps. 1971. I've just checked my notes. Brands Hatch Beach Buggy Race. It's all part of a program of races on at a day. An injured Sterling Moss. I think his leg was in plaster. Acted in a Father Christmas suit, and he was waving the races off on that day. Incidentally, John told me about that race once. It was a real hoot. But everybody apart from the GP team of Duplessis, Jobber, and their employee Mick Brown were cheating. Apparently, there was Big Bore. It was meant to be 4 buggies up to and including 1500cc, but John reckoned that everybody was cheating with Big Bore engines, and those were standard. But they still cleared off into the distance, and they won by a mile. I think Duplessis won and Jobber was second, and I think Brown may have finished third. I think it was that much of a clean sweep. But anyway, that's another little story. Then we have 1977, a thing called the GP Camel. Not one of the most successful cars. Only 3 were sold, for 1 year only. It was a revised take on the Kubelwagen that Neville Trickett had created for the Barbados Motor Company as a hire car vehicle, a holiday hire car vehicle. And as they hadn't collected it, Jobber put it in production as the Camel. It wasn't successful. The Centron was one that they'd really bet the farm on. They could see the buggy boom coming to an end, and they wanted to have something that would be a very attractive car. So it was created by Duplessis and former Unipower engineer designer, a guy called Valdair Bryan. And even though Car Mechanics and Hot Car and Popular Motoring had kind of shared a build story on the project in their magazines, it didn't take off at all, and only 12 were made. Although John was always a bit off about that. He felt he should have done a lot better, given the pedigree of the people designing it. And of course, there was a Centron 2 that came along a few years later that did even worse. Only 4 of those were made. And it was just a revised Centron with a modified door mechanism and a Ford Escort windscreen. But visually it was quite similar, but it didn't do any better. They also offered, we've jumped ahead of ourselves a bit, I'm going in alphabetical here really, rather than the numerical order, which is what I should have done. The Kubelwagen was devised by Neville Trickett. Although the Camel version, the thing that came to Camel was slightly different, he actually had done a replica of the Kubelwagen under his own auspices. And several of those were used by the production company responsible for the film A Bridge Too Far, incidentally. And GP Projects duly marketed that and sold about 30 of them, I think. It ended up with, one of the owners in subsequent years was GT Mouldings, James Hale. I think he only produced one though, and he sold it on to a guy in Ayrshire. I think that project ended up in Norway, but that just shows that's useless information for you. Anyway, the GP LDV was a 1970 product. Nothing to do with the erstwhile defunct van makers, LDV. This is a beach buggy. I mentioned it earlier. It was a pickup come beach buggy come van, standing for light delivery vehicle. Although quite a few surfers used to nail a surfboard to the top of it and go down to Newquay and such places with it. Had an Austin A40 rear window, used as a windscreen, which you couldn't get away with nowadays. Decent load area as well. They probably made 200 of them, I think. In fact, John told me that, so whether that's true, I would trust John to tell me that. The GP Madison we mentioned, and that was very good. That was sold again by Neville's own firm, Ground Effect Developments. John saw its potential and turned it into a GP product. It was a modified Beetle floorpan, and it was a Packard. It wasn't a replica, but it was inspired by Packard. And that long bonnet was ideal for a front engine fitment. So initially, although it was Beetle based, a Cortina based version did arrive in 1983. And then, indeed, it was the latter that was taken over by a Malaysian stroke Australian company called Brufori, who market it as a fully built cars. in the Far East, I think, well, Malaysia. A coupe version came along in 1983, and that I thought was a rather handsome car. But whereas I think 900 Madison's open top ones were sold, only 10, I think, of the coupe, which was very strange, I thought. Taken over later years by a guy called Dennis Weeks of the Madison Car Company in Brands Hatch before he moved to Suffolk, but he didn't do very much with it. The Ranchero was basically a super buggy with a hard top, and another one that used the A40 rear screen as a windscreen. The Turbo Beetle we've talked about, 150 by the way, 150 GP Rancheros were sold. The GP Turbo Beetle, Albar Mettler did over 200 in Switzerland. I'm not sure how many John did, maybe 20, 25. The Talon was an important car for GP. That one came along in 1979. Now that was Neville Trickett designed, modern two-seater, gull-wing doors no less. Still based on VW Beetle floorpan. In the Mark 1 form, 30 of those were sold. And then a revised Mark 2 came along, which sharpened things up a bit and gave more room in the cockpit. And generally did a little bit of a tidy up, really. And about 120 of those were sold. We've got to talk about the GP Spider. This is another, along with the GP Buggy. The Spider is the 718 RSK replica on a chopped VW Beetle floorpan devised by Neville Trickett, who'd actually, before that, had created a beautiful one-off nut-for-nut correct Spider based with Porsche parts and a Porsche 911 engine fitted, no less. Again, that was something that he offered to John, who saw the potential in about 1982. And ran with it from there. They did. There was one with an RS60, an RS60 style screen that enabled a fitment of weather gear as an option. Various sales figures have been bandied about. I mean, I've heard figures anything from 250 to 1500. I know what John told me several times over the years. I'm not entirely. I just don't know. I've heard so many different figures from people that used to work there. Neville came up with a different figure to John. I just don't know. It was a brilliant piece of kit. It was a brilliant kit. It really was. It's a great car. And however many were sold, you still see quite a few around and people love them. For obvious reasons, I think. Obvious reasons. A really great kit car. And that's the nuts and bolts of it, really. We mentioned the hovercraft before and the Rabbit and goodness knows what and all the other bits and pieces they did for other people, like the fire engine cabs for Dennis and things like that. Not heard from John for many years, never since he retired, really. As I said, he was a very shrewd businessman, always very amicable, friendly, and a shrewd businessman. Of that there can be no doubt. Another company, I wouldn't put them at the very, very top table, the table that features in sheer terms of sales, Caterham, Robin Hood, Dutton, companies such as that. But certainly in terms of quality, they belong right up there as well. That again, there can be no doubt. And certainly 4,000 beach, well, if you include all the other buggies they did, 5,000 over beach buggies is a hell of a lot. And I hope you've enjoyed that one. And I hope you've enjoyed it enough to hit the like button. If you're still here after getting this far, 29 minutes later, and you haven't already subscribed, please could I ask you to do so. Do the same if you could at Enwins Motors, the channel that we do these features in collaboration with, Neil Winnington's channel. If you could subscribe and like there, that would be greatly appreciated.
The Silhouette GS70 was definitely one of the very early attempts at an exotic kit car. Steve Hole tells the story.
Hi, my name's Steve Holt, editor at TKC Mag and TotalKitcar.com. Straight into this one, a child of its time from the early 70s called the Silhouette GS70. Quite a racy looking thing, available in 3 different styles. There was the fixed head version with conventional doors, a fixed head version with, well, gull-wing doorlets, and also a convertible with a very of its time skyscraper rear wing, which looks quite odd these days, doesn't it, I think. But anyway, interesting story to this one, because the guy that was behind the project had no interest in cars whatsoever, and took it over as a favour, I think, to a friend. But he did engage the services of one of the greats of 60s and 70s motorsport, a company called Grand Prix Metalcraft, who were absolute artisans of in their field, and they were doing the preparation work for him, building the chassis for him, and also I think he did a couple of fully built cars. They built them for him too. Anyway, guy's name was Anthony Yadgaroff, Yadgaroff. He hailed from a place called Bukhara in Kazakhstan. His family were in the fur trade, and he was based in central London, in the wonderfully named Great St Thomas Apostle Street in EC4, which is very close in the city of London, very close to St Paul's Cathedral. Long history of trading in fur in his family, I believe. His father had been a major in British Army in World War II. Anthony spoke, indeed, a very clever chap, English, French, Persian and Russian. And he left school at 17 to learn about the fur business. And indeed he went off to Germany to learn about dyeing, dressing and grading furs. There's also, I've read somewhere, and there's a couple of sort of contradictions in the story really, both in magazines, and there's no reason really to think that either of them were wrong. One says that as well as trading in fur, they were also big in the importation of Persian lamb into the UK. That one I'm not so certain about, but definitely they were fur merchants and had a long history of that. When he came back from Germany, he felt suitably qualified to go off on his own and spread his wings, and he set up as a fur merchant in direct competition with his father, nicknamed the Major, which must have gone down very well not. And that's his company. It was based in Great St Thomas Apostle Street. And how he got into the business is quite strange, really. A very close friend of his, I think, introduced him to a chap who had built his own car. There's plenty of that going on in the 70s, that's for sure. But didn't know really how to get it to market, and certainly, even if he did, I believe he didn't have the finances or the capital behind him to do so. Anthony did, even though he didn't really care about cars too much, I don't think. But he was persuaded to take it on. And indeed, he took on the car, which was the Silhouette, and the GS stood for Grand Sport. I don't know what the 70 stood for, but there we go. But the guy had renting a railway arch, try saying that quickly, a railway arch in Deptford in South London. And Anthony took that over as well. And as I said, you could order three types. You could order the conventional fixed head, the one with gull-wing doorlets, and the convertible. And in 1971, the kit was priced at $450, which, looking at my handy Bank of England inflation calculator or tracker, equates to £5,700 in today's money, August 2025, incidentally. I know that the gull-wing version, that was nicknamed the GS70 Zagaroff, and I think that was a bastardisation of Anthony's name, really. And I've also, the magazine that said his family were also lamb traders, also said that his name, Yadgaroff, was pronounced Zagaroff, and I don't know if I really don't know if they just used Zagaroff as it was easier to say for the English tongue, or whether indeed Yadgaroff is pronounced Zagaroff in his native Kazakhstan. I don't know. Cards on the table there. But they certainly sold 5 of the Zagaroffs, the gull-wing version. Maybe 1 convertible, and I think 12 of the standard fixed head. As I mentioned, they had Grand Prix Metalcraft do the preparation and engine building for them. I think what killed the car by 1973 there was a, and I'm not sure if it was because of this, but it certainly didn't do them any favours. And if they had inquiries coming in, they were probably rebuffed pretty quickly. A magazine, mainstream magazine of the day, an infamous report, and I've seen a copy of it. I haven't got the magazine actually, but I've seen a photocopy of it, and it wasn't particularly complimentary to say the least. I just quote one particular half of one paragraph. It said that anyone over average height wouldn't be able to get in it. Rear vision was terrible. It leaked. Featured loads of raw, very sharp GRP inside. The trim was at best described as shabby. And the best bit of the car for the reporter was the 1200cc engine that was belching smoke and had been taken or pillaged from a clapped out Beetle. That's very damning, and I know they say that no such thing as bad publicity, but that didn't do it any favours, that's for sure. So anyway, I think Anthony, he probably went into car production against his better will, really, and he probably spent a fair bit of money on getting a demonstrator built, and gave it a good go. I think there's no two ways about that. And I think that kind of took the wind out of his sails, and he probably just said, "That's it, I'm done." Amazingly, it's not the end of that story. In a 5-year hiatus, we go to 1978, and a guy called Adrian Wood, who later was involved with the Avanti project, and Terry Sands, a well-known name in the kit car industry, somehow got hold of the GS70 moulds and brought it back to life for a couple of years with, I think they used the original moulds for the bodies, but they certainly, one of Terry's Amiga chassis underpinned the car, which was considered to be better than the original silhouette chassis, which I don't know if it was a Beetle floorpan. Actually, it could well have been. That is unknown, but I think it was very much a child of its time. I think by 1978 that car had pretty much run its course, really, and it had no chance. I mean, it was kind of damned from the moment that it came about, originally, by the way, but I think that certainly didn't do any good. And that was it. Never seen or never heard from or seen again. However, I do know there are at least a couple on the road. And I mentioned the word Avanti. That was wrong, actually. When Adrian Wood was behind the Alto, which was, God forbid, that was the pretty much dead ringer for an Avanti, which itself had clearly been inspired by the Nova. So that's another can of worms, so I won't go there. But so that was Adrian's first sort of dabble with kit cars. But Terry was obviously the man involved with Sheldonhurst, Legend, LR Roadsters, Americar, all sorts of companies that Terry's been involved with, really. Indeed, a well-known name in the 70s and 80s in the UK kit car, on the UK kit car scene. Anyway, that's the end of the GS70 story. I hope you've enjoyed that one. As I mentioned, it was very much a child of its time. It could only ever have worked in the early 1970s. I haven't seen the one that I definitely know was on the road around for ages. I've seen it a couple of times at various shows in recent years. A red one. But
can't really tell the story of Volkswagen-based kits without covering one of the other great marks of the 1980s. The Unique Vehicle and Accessory Company, better known as UVA.
If you hear some funny noises tonight, I was sitting in the office. On this one, I was sitting in the office, and it was like an oven in there. Even though it's 7 o'clock in the evening in deepest East Sussex. I know I often joke about sunny East Sussex, but it really is today. And I was boiling in the office, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to go and mix it with the blackbirds and all the other little critters that are singing out here at the moment. So forgive me if there's any sort of nature noises, so to speak. But welcome to another episode anyway, and I hope you've been enjoying the videos we've been putting out, covering the best of the British kit car industry, 75 years of existence. Again, if the sound quality is a bit ropey, that aside from the sound of nature, I don't really know what I'm doing with this sort of stuff, so forgive me. I bought a new microphone thing the other day, which is on the useless side of hopeless. I've just bought another one, so I'm hoping this might be a little bit better, but I need some help setting the little rig up. Rig, that sounds very very professional, doesn't it? So anyway, this time we're going to be looking at a company that was around and burnt brightly for about 7 years and then didn't. They're right at the pinnacle of the industry until they weren't. I'm also aware that these videos don't need to be too long, so I'm going to try and speed up a little bit. The company in question was called Unique Vehicle Accessories Company, UVA for short, best known as UVA, based in Newbury. But let's wind it all the way back. The man behind the company was a nice chap, a marketing professional, I would say, called Alan Arnold. Oh, there goes a plane into Gatwick. There we go. Oh, look at that, EasyJet, I think. Easy to get distracted. Yeah, where was I? Alan, a very nice bloke. He'd cut his teeth. I think he'd done some autocross in an old Austin A30 when he was a teenager. Outright ACSMC hill climb champion in 1970, and also won his class in his Lotus 7 a couple of years later. He then got into circuit racing, but his career was cut short. He told me about this. He had a massive accident at Brands Hatch when driving a Ferrari Dino. And he always reckoned that he was on the very lucky side to escaped unscathed from what was a nasty accident by the sound of it. He then took up a career in automotive marketing. Products under his control included, though big for the time, CBS brakes, Link Hansen car aerials. I remember them when I was a kid. My dad had one of their, was it a whip? Remember that? About 10 foot long. In danger of taking people's eyes out walking down the pavement, I seem to remember, but he thought it was cool. And perhaps most notably, STP oil treatment. But he had a very, very keen interest in hot rods and indeed the Volkswagen Beetle scene, which would stand him in good stead when he set up UVA. He also built a custom, I think it was a Ford Transit, but he turned it into like a custom van that he called Super Van, which no, it's nothing to do with those Cosworth DFV super vans that Ford produced as publicity stunts all those years ago. This one was sponsored by CBS Brakes, strangely enough, and I remember that appearing in Custom Car magazine. In fact, I think I found the episode the other day. The issue the other day from 1972, where the car was on the front cover. Anyway, he tentatively set up UVA in 1981. Originally, the sole intention that Alan had was to import American VW tuning parts into the UK, which obviously in the States were massive and still are. And so his idea was to act as agents or importers for people such as, or companies such as Bugpack, Sway Away, and the mighty MP. I think what he was trying to achieve, he told me, and I'm talking 40 years ago nearly, was to create a grown-up version, if you will, of a hot rod speed shop type business. Initially, he based himself in his house, in fact, his double garage, in I think the place is called Courage, Curridge, in Hampshire. And I remember talking to his wife Lorna, a very nice lady, and she said those years were quite fraught, really. What she described, her lovely house was being taken over and literally awash with all manner of VW bits and pieces and boxes all over the place. They even employed 3 staff, even in those early days, to look after the stock and pack and dispatch the orders. They inevitably remortgaged their property and used all their savings really to get UVA up and going, because they could see it had promise. When Alan's friend, a guy called Terry Lee, came on board as co-director, things started really to, I think, the old cliche, light blue touch paper and stand back. It sort of gathered pace when they had two of them sort of re-attacking the market. Alan was the king of marketing, and Terry very, very good on the technical side. I think German car dealers these days usually describe their kingpin, their top man in the workshop, as a master tech or something like that. Well, Terry was whatever the equivalent was back in the early 80s. I think he worked for a Mercedes-Benz dealership, so he was very hot with the spanners. He certainly, if he wasn't the boss of that service department, he was certainly the most knowledgeable technical person working there. I seem to recall there was a chap called Bill Badsey who produced a couple of, well, I think they were one-offs actually, but they were intended to be series production kits. One was called the Eagle, and for about 5 minutes before deciding to go a different route, I think Alan and Terry were actually agents for Bill Badsey's Eagle kit. But the thing they decided to do, which was probably the best thing for them at the time, was to visit California and do a deal with a company called Manta Cars, a kit car company in California called Manta Cars, to import what was then a very hot-selling Beetle-based kit called the Montage. Looked a bit like a McLaren M6. They sold a few of those, but they continued to really be washed, sort of overburdened with orders for the VW parts that they were bringing in. And around about that time as well, possibly the kit they're most, or the range of kits they're most known for, the bread and butter really, I suppose, was the Fugitive appeared. And there were several versions of that, but let's talk about the first one. In fact, let's talk about that very, very, very first kit, the UVA, the Baja Bug. They probably did about, well, Alan told me once about 115. So even if you said 100, that's not bad going. So they were busy with that. It was basically a Baja Beetle conversion for a Beetle. Popular sector in the industry, particularly in the US, and similar, I suppose, in the US to the UK's beach buggy craze 10 years earlier, although not quite on such a large scale. Even so, I remember Alan telling me they were doing 20 of those kits a month for a time, well, five months, but they went out like the proverbial hot baked goods. 7-piece GRP kit for a Beetle. That's what that was. But anyway, then we come on to their real bread and butter, of which they probably, it's called the Fugitive. Well, you might see it described as the Fugitive F20, the Fugitive 2. It had several names, but it was basically a 2-seat sandrail. And that again was inspired by more American fun and frolics. That was a Californian Baja Desert Racers. And UVA was a leading competitor and supporter of the SCOR, SCO Championship in the UK in the 80s. And those vehicles were ideal for that. And they were road legal as well. Basically, I guess, an early exponent of the Exo skeletal car, really, when you think about it. It had a bit more GRP than those, but certainly it was a chassis frame with a token 5-piece GRP panel set. UVA's one was very well built. And they do for the customer whatever you wanted, really. They'd even sort of build you a fully built car, or they would weld the complete rear torsion assembly onto your chassis from your donor. Could be quite tricky for a guy in his garage. Ideal donor to use was the 1300 twin port Super Beetle from, I think, in mid-70s, and because Alan said that had all the right and best parts on it. You didn't have to use a Beetle engine though, because Terry had designed it so mounts could be fabricated for various Ford engines, including Crossflow and CVH, I think, as well as an Alpha Flat 4, or even a water-cooled VW engine. I think one from a Golf or Polo of the time. And then confusingly, there were, I think, 5 variants of the F20 or the F2 or the F Roman numerals F11. The F2/1 was a racing version, 2-seater. In fact, they were all 2-seaters, I think. The F2/2 was a lightweight 2-seater. The F2/3 was a racing single. Oh, that was a single-seater, I think that one was. And that was purely off-road. And then you had the F2/4 lightweight single-seat off-road racer. In fact, I lied, there were 2 single-seaters. And then finally the F2/5, which was a lightweight 2-seat off-roader, and that was aimed at the two-wheel drive class of the all-wheel drive club championship, I think. But whatever you look at that, however you look at that, they did 500 of those, definitely, all day long. Well, no, of course they didn't do all 500 in a day, that would be silly. But there was also the fugitive F30, only did 4 of those, and that was an in-betweeny, really. It was a logical evolution of the F20, and it featured a mid rather than rear-mounted engine, which were normally Rover V8 flavoured. And that had, we're going to come on to this in a minute, UVA's own front end conversion with a VW variant rear end. It was a bit of an in-betweeny, really, because I don't think there was a score class for it to race in. So it just didn't really take off, sadly, for them. Then there was a F40 or F4, which logically enough was a 4-seater version of the F20 that really was more like a 2+2. If anyone was taller than sort of Frankie Dettori, you would struggle to get in the back, unless you wanted your head to poke above the integral roll cage if you sat in the back of that car. Most people use the rear bench for luggage carrying anyway. So there was another, the pinnacle for me of the fugitive range, but we'll come to that one in a minute because we're jumping slightly ahead of ourselves and we need to go back to the main story on it, really. And that was going back to the Manta. But around about this time, when the kit started selling as well, Lorna said enough was enough, and she wanted her home back, which I think was pretty fair enough, really. So Alan found the company a very swish 4,000 square foot glass fronted building on a new build industrial estate. I think they used to call them science parks in the mid-80s, didn't they, when they were flash glass fronted? And it was called Argent's Mere High Technology Park, and that was on the outskirts of Newbury in Berkshire. Very slick building, and it was a well set up operation. They always had demonstrators of all their models. I think Neil had put up one of the photos of something showing just that. The workshop, sorry, not the workshop, the showroom, the workshop in the distance, and I think about 3 or 4 demonstrators between them, between those 2 areas. So they were always very slick in the way they marketed themselves and presented themselves. More importantly, I mean, if you were going to Kitcar shows back in the day, you knew when you saw the UVA stand, it was very good. That's one of Alan's bugbears, but we'll come to that in a minute actually as well. So a very slick operation. Probably talking about Alan and his dislike for clutter. The UVA is probably responsible more than anyone else really for helping drag the standard of Kitcar show stands up a notch or 3, I think, if you think about it. I think Alan upset a few people when he sort of told them how they should be presenting themselves. He did rub a few people up the wrong way, definitely. But he hated, he made no bones about it, he hated with a passion what he saw as tat. I think one Kitcar manufacturer of the day who's still around, who is never afraid to call a spade a sledgehammer. I won't name him. If you've been around for a while, you might be able to guess who it is. But he kind of accused Alan of being the self-appointed standards controller, which he didn't like. But others were thankful for the efforts that he made. Alan was definitely the reason why some of those very, very tacky and although classed as sexist, I suppose these days were what they were for that time. It was the way things were then. Really strange and outrageous strap lines on adverts and stuff. He certainly railed against that sort of outrageous Kitcar adverts that made ridiculous claims on them as well, which is interesting. Terry Lee's wife, Melanie, she joined, made it a real family affair, and she came along and she headed up UVA's in-house graphic design studio. Very, very grandly named, but that's exactly what it was, and they didn't just produce their own adverts. They always changed their adverts regularly, I seem to remember. Every magazine had a different one every month, and they had a different one for every magazine every month, if you know what I mean. Big advertisers. But they also produced stuff for other businesses around the Newbury area. I think from menus for restaurants to adverts for double glazing companies, that sort of thing. But as I said earlier, Alan really was a king of marketing. Very, very good at that, and a very good networker. Anyway, they sold a few montage kits before Terry Lee had got to work on it in the workshop to better suit the UK customers' needs and indeed UVA's requirements. And they came up with the UVA M6 GTR, which was more closely aligned to a McLaren M6. A rival for Tornado before they really got Andrew Sheldon got stuck into the brilliant GT40 that he still makes to this day. He and his father were producing, another Alan actually, were producing an M6 McLaren, and those two went right head to head for a while. But I remember when Alan, the day before Alan launched that, we were doing an action day at Mallory Park racing circuit. I think we're talking 1986 July, something like that. Not only did we, when I worked for Kitcars and Specials, we sponsored the Castle Combe event, which was the one that most people remember. We also sponsored a couple, also run by Stephen Roberts, at Mallory Park, and a brilliant one at Knock Hill. Got a great story about that one, but that'll say for another day. When they launched that car, the M6 GTR, at the British Motor Show, at the NEC, a famous racing driver, John Miles, was there to unveil it, I think, from memory. But I remember going back to what I said about meeting Alan in the car park of the hotel the night before he launched that car at Mallory Park Action Day. He was really proud of it. You could tell he was really, really buoyant about it. He was, as content as he could be. They did continue to sell the Beetle-based montage, but it kind of took a back seat once they brought the all singing, all dancing M6 GTR out. But they'd always been keen to market their own UVA-produced kit car, and that indeed was the first fully UVA-produced kit. And they did actually produce a supercar at a pocket money price when you think about it. Although their demonstrator and the recommended engine for that car was Rover V8, I think they had customers who fitted a VW Golf engine to one Ford CVH, and probably, knowing Terry, where he offered various choices, others as well. Going back to their own range of parts, as well as selling stuff from MP and people and Bugpack and people like that, they also did their own fabricated range of parts, which were popular. They did UVA branded Beetle engine casings, which was a good seller. They imported, well, on that subject, they imported Kennedy Engineering's adapter plates, which allowed other engines to fit a Beetle gearbox. And possibly the best and most popular thing they did, they produced a conversion package which did away with the McPherson strut front end, and that meant that customers could use 1302, 1303 Beetles as donors, which they'd been precluded from doing really, or with any ease really, up until that point. It had a very impressive rocker arm structure type arrangement, very race car like, but it was a good package and very popular. 1983, they were appointed as agents for VDO instruments, and also IHI turbochargers came on board. And Alan set up the British Off-Road Association, or he was involved with the setup of that, called BORA, BRRA, which brought a bit of extra credence to them, and of course healthy publicity. Alan and Terry would often, when they had something to test, they'd often regularly sort of head off to the nearby Ridgeway route, is it, or Green Lane route, on the outskirts of Newbury. In fact, here comes a little bit of trivia for you. You know I like a bit of trivia. I think the Ridgeway Green Lane route, or that particular track, is Britain's oldest road, I think. Anyway, whatever it was absolutely ideal for putting fugitives through their muddy paces. To continue his work as trying to eradicate what he saw as unacceptable behaviour of certain kit car companies, he didn't want the damage, any damage, to be sort of passed on to him and other slick operations. Didn't want to be tarred with their brush, in other words. He actively worked with the SMMT, and he set up or helped to set up the SCMG division within SMMT, which was Specialist Car Manufacturing Group. And others on that board of that sort of little group or subgroup was Graham Nern from Catering Cars. The Bora thing that he'd started was taking off. Obviously, marketing was at the forefront of what he did, and so the Fugitive was absolutely perfect for that. So that's where that comes in, and lots of Fugitives were sold because of that. Then we come to the pinnacle of the F33, the Fugitive range, and the F33 Can-Am. Only made 12 of them, I think. Should have done more. Possibly didn't really know its own identity, because it didn't know really what it was. But I know what it was. It was a complete bonkers scaffold tube structure with, well, very little GRP, in the way of GRP bodywork, and that certainly must have been one of the forerunners for the exoskeletal scene, some 12 years before the Aero Atom burst onto the scene. So it was based on a Fugitive F4 or F40 chassis, modified for a mid-engined Rover V8 fitment. Made jaws drop when it appeared in 1986, both on looks reasons and outrageous performance. Alan said it was for customers who didn't like the cycle style wings of the F30 or the F3, much preferring the flying up and over style, which the F33 had. It featured a twin wishbone front end and a full length under tray, and it was aimed at fast road as well as track use. Probably ahead of its time, as it probably, if you go to sort of now, it'd be an ideal track day weapon. It really would. It didn't weigh very much. They revamped it in 1988 and added 3 inches to the legroom and a couple of inches of extra headroom, because I think that was a complaint that when you had a crash helmet on, you'd struggle to get your head up without sort of banging your helmet on every time you hit a bump. And they also revised the front suspension. I think now, I've got to think about this one, I think a chap called Jonathan Saville was responsible for the design of it. I wouldn't say bodywork, because it didn't have any. And I always remember 2 things about the F33. Well, 3 really, because I keep coming back to the word bonkers. But I remember Terry taking me for a ride on its debut at, might have been Castle Combe, that one, in September '86, I think, maybe. And it was a strap in, jump in, strap in, and hold on type thing. What a fantastic experience it was, and blisteringly quick. And I've never forgotten it. I always remember getting out of that after the ride, and I think it was Lorna, could have been Melanie, but Lorna, I think, who wondered, who was worried because I didn't look very well. In fact, I was quite queasy looking, and I did have to confess I went to the nearest toilet block on the infield at Castle Combe, and I was on the paddock at Castle Combe, and I was promptly sick. Nothing to do with the beers the night before, I promise, Governor. But such was the brutality of that ride. But what a ride! And then the other thing I remember about the F-33 was a year or so later, Alan let me have a drive of it to do a test for Kitcars and Specials. And I remember, I think knowing me, it probably was a facetious question. I asked him if it had a heater before going off for a test drive. And it was a brutally cold February morning, which probably wasn't the best idea. And I always remember there are certain things in my career that have stuck in my mind that people have said to me over the years about cars and things. And the answer that Alan gave me while looking me dead in the eye was, yes, Steve, it's called adrenaline. And I've always loved that. I loved it then and I love it now. But what a car. And no, it didn't have a heater. Anyway, moving on. And then they probably did, I think it was 15 M6 GTRs. It sounds like a bargain, but the starter kit cost £3,500, I think, in 1987, which is equivalent to about 6,700 today. They'd even build you a fully built Rover 3.9 V8 version for 21 grand, probably, which I think equates to 41,000 last time I checked. Other kits they did, there was a thing called the Shogun, made about 15 of those. That was basically a Beetle front. It was a Beetle donor, really, with a Beetle front end. But from the door jambs back, the C-pillars, the body was replaced with an estate type section, like a van with windows. They'd intended to import an American kit called the Vendetta, but weren't happy with that, so they devised their own version of it. Definitely a rival, I suppose, of GP Project's LDV kit. And GP, by the way, were big rivals for UVA in certain other things they did. And the other big rival was Kingfisher Customs, the legend that is Dave Fisher. And those three drove each other on in the 80s kit car scene, and all of them were really busy as well. And then kind of UVA came to a halt, really, and very sadly. As I said, when I came in, their star burnt really brightly and then burnt itself out. I guess 6 or 7 years. I think they had 11 years of existence, but I think they were really big and busy for 6 or 7 of those years. They went into voluntary liquidation, I think, in 1991, and ex-Ford development engineer Gwyn Parry joined the company, at which time the name was changed to TAG, which I think stood for nothing simpler than Terry Allen and Gwyn. Changed again to Laser Cars in 1992, which really was the end of the road, or the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning, with just Terry Lee left after Alan had gone off to do other stuff, which I'll come to in a minute, and Parry departed. I didn't know Gwyn Parry, but Terry I always found to be a happy-go-lucky and a very talented man. But as I said, he left the customer-facing stuff very much to Alan, which is what Alan loved. Terry was happiest giving scary test drives or on the spanners. But a very good company for that time, and that particular 6 or 7 years was very successful for them, and I suppose coincided with the boom of kit cars in the mid-80s. It coincided with that. Whether they drove that or whether they were in the right place at the right time to benefit from that, I don't know. I think Alan, I'm not sure what he did immediately after UVA. I do believe they had some sort of troubles, I think, with the company going into liquidation and such like. It couldn't have been a very easy time at all. But I know that by 1994 he joined a group that set up what was called, I think, the UK Shopping City, which was described as Europe's largest online marketing site. So an early tilt at, I suppose, eBay type thing, online auction or sales portal. And they followed that a year later by a thing called TED, the European Directory, which I guess was an early Google search engine. Certainly both were ahead of their time, and early, if you think about it, in sort of 1994. I don't think I had a computer until 1997. I think they sold both elements of the business anyway in 1998, which I guess was a year or three before the dot-com boom, but I hope they did all right out of that. Last heard of, Alan went back to sort of do some marketing work, and the last I heard, he was running a staff training company. If he's reading this, I'd welcome a chat with him. It's been a long time since we last spoke, and a lot of admiration for what he and Terry did. And there we have it. That's the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed that one.
Of course, there are many other Volkswagen-based kit cars, and we will come back to the subject for certain in future videos. If you've enjoyed this one, please give us a thumbs up. It tells the algorithm and people like us that there's something here that they'll enjoy. And whilst you're at it, click on the bell icon, and then on the drop down, click on all, and that will tell you when new videos come along. But in the meantime, why don't you check out these videos?